All right, so second order draft workshop. Welcome everybody. Just very briefly, as you're all aware, the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment is led by the Environment Division, and Canary Caribbean Natural Resources Institute is supporting. My name is Natalie Bodram. I am the project manager at Canary for the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. The assessment, which I will go into a little bit more detail later, is led by three co-chairs, Professor John Agard, Ms. Sandra Ferguson, and Ms. Aria St. Louis, who will deliver a few remarks before we get into the meat of the matter. And then, as always, with any Canary initiative, this is a very participatory process. And in addition to our team of over 100 authors, we are including and utilizing inputs, review, and feedback from national stakeholders, from civil society, private sector, etc. And this workshop is one of those attempts to ensure that this is a participatory feedback, where specifically we're looking for feedback on, to use the terminology, it's what's called the second order draft of the National Ecosystem Assessment. Okay, so the workshop is actually 2 days, today and on Tuesday next week. And today we'll be focusing on 2 chapters, and then next week we'll focus on another 2 chapters. And as I've indicated, we're looking to present the draft chapters, try to get some feedback, get a little bit of local knowledge, and also some perspectives, which we also want to include in the document to make it as relevant as possible. So that was my welcome and very brief introduction. If we do not have PS Jessamy on the call, I would ask our, there's a Michael Jessamy.
Yes.
Who is not our PS. Yes, Aditi or Anastasia, please confirm the PS is not in the waiting room or has joined the call. PS Marina Jessamy?
No.
No? All right, so then we will proceed, and I will ask our civil society co-chair, Ms. Sandra Ferguson, to deliver a few remarks. Please go ahead, Sandra.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning to everyone again. I'm going to keep it very brief. Again, to thank Canary for the opportunity to be part of this team. And my interest particularly is in the civil society participation in this process. And out of that, we were able to get a commitment that there will be a document that will focus on civil society, putting in a lot of the technical knowledge in a format that is, more comprehensible, more easily understood, and will enable us to strengthen our voice or claim a space in those areas for ensuring input and participation into decisions as it relates to our natural spaces and our ecosystem. This is part of the process. I congratulate all of you for making the time, and participation in these processes incrementally enhances our capacity to participate and make informed contributions. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to a fruitful half day.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Professor John Agard, who is our technical co-chair. John, can you go ahead and deliver your remarks?
Yes, I'll make brief remarks as well. As indicated, I'm the technical co-chair. I have been involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as well as coordinating lead author, and I've also been involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on IPCC for more than 15 years, 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment. So I have a lot of experience about, the technical part. I'm a scientist, professor of tropical island ecology And this is my input is really about fact checking. People can't make claims in which they don't have any reference or anything or any study to refer to. So I am checking on making sure that everything is in line with the published literature. Although we're going to try and get some inputs from, things that are not published, maybe by personal references and so forth. So we will try and see if we could make that happen. And that's as much as I would like to say and hand it back over. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, John. And John is my main guidance actually in terms of this process. Yeah, very specific steps for when you do these types of ecosystem assessments following the IPBES methodology. So a lot of my questions to John is, what is the next step? It is a bit of a long and complicated process to get it done. So thanks very much to both John and Sandra for their remarks. We do not have with us Ms. Aria St. Louis, who heads the Environment Division and is our other co-chair, but she will be joining us on Friday, and she may have some remarks not on Friday, on Tuesday, and she may have some remarks at that point. Okay, so I am going to speak for a little while again to just go through the project summary and status, go through the workshop agenda. We'll do a little participant introduction, and I'll just give you a very short outline of chapters in the NEA. But first, we actually want to do a little Mentimeter poll. And great, so people have started filling out thus far. So what we're trying to figure out is who's on the call and what has been your involvement with the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment thus far. Aaron, I am not able to see the screen. So when more people have, well, I'm seeing the screen, but the writing is a bit small. I'm assuming you can see it clearer on your machine. Let's give it a minute or two, and then perhaps you can summarize what you're seeing there. You can see the categories better, yes?
Yes, I can see the categories.
Okay, cool, because I cannot make it out at all. All right, let's see. It looks like it's stopped right now. Aaron, can you summarize, please?
Sure. So we have participated in virtual global workshops, training related to Grenada NEA. So for example, those organized by IPPS, IPBES, and WCMC. And the authors, example, the co-chairs, well, it's changing now, but basically the participants in virtual global workshops and training, that number has reached to 8. That's the highest. We have a tie for the authors, co-chairs, coordinating lead authors, contributing authors and fellows, and participated in the ecosystem evaluation training series from February to March 2021 at number 7. We have first time participating in the NEA event at number 6. Again, the numbers are changing as we speak. We have participated in scoping report stakeholder consultation in 2019 and 2020 at 5. We have participated in the hybrid scenarios workshop in March of 2022 at 4. Participated in the Foresight Scenarios training series in August to September 2021 at 3. Also at 3 is responded to surveys and collected or contributed data, records, or literature. Participated in the cell phone video competition at 2. And at 1, we have provided feedback on the zero order draft and contributed local knowledge or participated in interviews.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Aaron.
No problem.
So what we've realized then is that many of you have already been heavily engaged in this process as authors, as contributors. Some of you have participated in some of our stakeholder engagement events, for example, our cell phone video. And I think we have 6 people, I still can't see the screen, who this is their first time attending an event. Yes, right. So all I have to say, thank you very much for being here. And given that most of you have participated in a number of events and a number of aspects of the project, thank you very much for your continued participation. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Aaron, I will go back and share my screen again. So we have an idea of how familiar our participants are with the NEA. And just very, very quickly, seeing that most of you have already attended workshops and so forth and are familiar with the project. So the Grenada NEA is part of a global initiative. Right now, it is about 12 countries that are working to do national ecosystem assessments, and it is part of an initiative which actually supports IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Assessments. And this is funded by the government of Germany, but the main project of managing these 12 countries that are participating in the NEAs is the responsibility of the United Nations World Conservation Monitoring Center. So we're one of 12 countries and we're all administered by WCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Center. And what is exciting is that Grenada is the first island and Caribbean country to be conducting an NEA. Since we started, the Dominican Republic has also joined the process, but Grenada is the first, it's the smallest in terms of population size and geographic area to be participating in this initiative. So what this project is head towards doing is that the main output is in fact an assessment report. So it's currently at, I don't know how many hundreds of pages, and there's a constant struggle to try to streamline it. But the report itself is addressing the current status and threats to key ecosystems in Grenada. And what the focus is on showcasing the value of these ecosystems, including economic value, but not only economic value. We're also trying to showcase cultural, social value, historical value, etc., of these particular ecosystems type. And then what we're trying to do is explore scenarios and try to highlight trade-offs among development options based on the information that we are presenting within the National Ecosystem Assessment. We're also doing policy support tools and methodologies for decision makers. So how do we use this information to help guide policy development and updating, for instance? And we're also focusing heavily on communication materials, including case studies, lessons learned, and specific products that I'll talk about later that Sandra alluded to help facilitate the uptake of the information and use of the information by practitioners. We are doing this process via a strong participatory process, and it is aimed at ensuring that stakeholders are involved in the development of the assessment. Basically, we designed the project initially pulling in everybody's perspectives and areas of emphasis that they want to include. So it was both designed and executed in a participatory manner. And we are looking to do the assessment in a way that can easily allow and efficiently allow people to input data and information. And we also want to make sure that the outputs and the products are able to be easily accessed, understood, and utilized. And we also want to make sure that the information is endorsed, promoted, and used not only for Grenada, but also throughout the Caribbean in terms of the methodology, for instance. So currently there are some negotiations going on to do national ecosystem assessments of countries like Montserrat, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent through the OECS, through CARICOM. And it is anticipated that they will be using the same methodology that was utilized for the Grenada NEA. So the Grenada NEA is the template for this future work. So this is a very large scale collaborative research project. We actually have over 100 authors from both Grenadian and non-Grenadian agencies and communities. So we have involved the Grenadian civil society, key government agencies. We have folks from the OECS Commission involved. As I said, there's much interest in this as a model or template for future work in the Caribbean. And we do have our author teams, many of whom are associated with the University of the West Indies, St. George's University, University of Trinidad and Tobago. And we do have some folks, mostly Caribbean people, but affiliated with organizations and universities such as Cambridge, University of Tokyo, the Illinois Institute of Technology. And you can find more information of our author teams at the website provided. So the chapters, which are currently 5 chapters, we actually ended up merging 2 chapters. They look at what is a national ecosystem assessment, why, and how it will contribute to better decision making. We have that chapter and the second chapter that will be presented today, which is on the status, trends, and threats to different ecosystem types in Grenada. On Tuesday next week, we will be focusing on the valuation of genetic and ecosystem resources in Grenada. And then, oh, I'm sorry, I made a little mistake here. The other chapter that we will be focusing on Tuesday is actually the climate change chapter, led by coordinating lead author Cindy, who is on this call. So my apologies, Cindy, I made a mistake and didn't include that chapter. And we also will be having 2 chapters that we're not addressing right now, but we'll be working on those a little bit more before we bring it back to the stakeholders. And those are the chapters that address policy options and scenarios. Okay, so the assessment is ongoing. We're about 3/4 of the way done because the project is actually supposed to finish in March, June. And we've been doing several drafts. So we're currently on the 2nd order draft. That's just a best terminology. And this is the draft that we're looking to get feedback on at this point in time. We expect the process to be done between March to June next year. And what we expect to produce is the main NEA document. We'll be doing a summary for policymakers, various communication materials, and depending on what is going on and what the government of Grenada would like us to try to do, we could look at addressing at least maybe 1 policy document to try to update using the NEA information. So that's going to happen next year. What we are excited about and what Sandra mentioned, we had always planned on doing tools or guidelines or products to support citizen use of the NEA information. Budget was running a little bit low, so we actually went looking for extra money, and we have received funding from a project, which is a JEF project on integrating water, land, and ecosystems. And they are providing us with funding to do the document that Sandra mentioned, which is the CSO or Citizens Guide to the NEA, which is basically taking this several 100-page document and packaging it into a smaller, compact, user-friendly document for people to use as they go through their daily activities, or if they need to communicate particular things to their communities or their CSOs or to their members of parliament. How do they use this NEA information to do that? And to support also this process in terms of the uptake of the information, we are actually doing a workshop on the communication of environmental information to support civil society in the use of the NEA information. So you have not seen any notices about that workshop, but it's actually going to start on the 5th of October. So literally a couple of weeks away. And you all will be all invited and sent various registration links. We just have not addressed this yet because we wanted to focus on the this feedback workshop. And the idea of doing these 2 workshops close together is that you all are fully immersed in the information and then can think about how and what we want to communicate from what was presented over these last couple of days and over today and on Tuesday for that communication workshop that we'll be doing. And actually we have the main trainer for that workshop on this call, so she can also get a better idea of how to tailor that workshop to suit the needs of our stakeholders. Okay, so that was a mouthful. I think that's the longest you'll hear me talk. I can ask for any questions or comments at this time before we move on. Anybody has anything to say or ask? Aditi, is there anything in the chat?
No questions so far.
All right, great. All right, so after that summary, we actually just want to do a very quick introduction. So can we do what is called a chat storm? So I know most of us know each other already, but what I would like you to do is in the chat, don't hit enter as yet, but the chat storm is if you can please put your name, organization, any other information you wish to share about you or your work, and any particular interest you have with regards to Grenada species and ecosystems. Don't hit enter until I tell you to do so. So can everybody take about 3 minutes to just put in that information? This is our rapid way of everybody introducing themselves via the chat. And I will give you all a couple minutes to do that. And then I'll tell you hit enter, and then we'll see everybody who's on this call and what they would like to say. Great, so please go ahead and do that via chat. And GT, so I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see the chat. All right, so go ahead and fill in that information and hold for a little while until I tell you to enter. So your name, your organization, if relevant, any particular type of work that you do that you want to highlight, any particular area of interest with regards to the Grenada NEA. Okay, so apparently Martin, our esteemed CLA, doesn't understand wait until I say go, but that's okay. Actually, go ahead, guys, hit enter, and please introduce yourselves. So we have Martin, who is one of our coordinating lead authors. We have several of our authors, Jonathan, Carl from Grenada Investment Development Company. Carl, sorry, welcome. I don't think I know you. The others, please go ahead and hit enter so we see who's on the chat or who's on the call. Joyce is there. Joyce Thomas, she's one of our authors as well. We have Alana, who is an author on chapter 2. Joseph, welcome, Joseph. Joseph is one of the civil society representatives from Friends of the Earth. Okay, Evans, thank you for being here. Karim, who's also an author. Brian, who is an author as well. Claire from SU. Okay, Ingrid. Oh, Ingrid is representing an environmental organization. Oh, right. I think that's Davon's group from Karaoke, but I'm not sure. And you are managing 600 acres of forest. Very nice. Terrence, hi Terrence, long time. Terrence, I know, is very active water resources person with the Global Water Partnership, amongst other stuff. Rahim representing you. Claire, of course, is very interested in turtles and marine ecosystems. Great. Hayden is there from WindRef, participating in his personal capacity. And I know, yes, Hayden has a very particular interest in freshwater ecosystems. He actually participated in our cell phone video competition.
We have Michael Jasmine from the Heritage Conservation. He's a Heritage Conservation Officer. Joseph Newell, glad to have you on the call, from Ministry of Agriculture.
All right, so as we are aware, today's activities is on getting feedback on chapters 1 and 2. And right after this, we will immediately go into the presentation from chapter 1. And to remind you guys, when you all are interacting, first of all, please participate. We want your feedback. If you need to speak, raise your hand and we will unmute you or whatever is needed. But please also use the chat to talk if you don't get a chance to put in your thoughts verbally. Please be concise in your comments. We want to give everybody a chance to speak. Be respectful to each other. Please keep your microphones on mute. And this is not the only chance to give feedback on this draft. We will actually resend the chapter summaries and indicative questions. Please email us back with any sort of additional feedback. Also, to let you all know, we actually need detailed chapter reviewers. So we have not and will not share widely the actual chapter summaries. First of all, because not summaries, the actual chapters. Firstly, because they are draft. But secondly, because it is an unpublished document as yet, we don't want widespread use of it until it is published. So anybody who's interested in being a reviewer, we do need you to be a reviewer, but we will require that you sign a confidentiality agreement. And anybody who does sign up to be a reviewer will be credited within the document as a reviewer as well. As I mentioned, the document is still in draft and we will be editing and correcting further, including based on any feedback that you provide today. In particular, or any diagrams or maps shared are still in draft. We need to do a final screening of the data layers used, etc. So again, we're not going to share those widely because they are still in draft. And again, please be a reviewer. All right, so I think that's it. And given my unstable internet, I do want to switch across very quickly to chapter 1. And our two presenters today are Jonathan Rosenberg and Kerry Mitchell, and they will be talking. I'll do just a brief biography of them each. They are presenting on their chapter that they are leading along with a much larger author team who you all will have noted within the chapter summaries that were sent out. And they will be talking about why we're doing this assessment and how we hope it will contribute to better decision making. And just to give you an idea of the two presenters and coordinating lead authors for chapter 1, Dr. Kerry Mitchell is in the Department of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at SGU. He holds an undergraduate degree in environmental sciences and postgraduate work in biological sciences. And in particular, he's interested in environmental quality and looking at the impacts of poor environmental stewardship on ecosystem health. Dr. Jonathan Rosenberg is a professor of political science at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, and he teaches environmental politics and policy. And he has done a lot of research on Grenada and in general throughout the Caribbean related to the politics of economic development and environmental politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. Great. So Aaron, with that, I'm going to turn over to the two presenters and Aaron will be sharing the slides for them. So thank you all very much for your patience with my internet issues, and let's move on. Thanks, guys. Aaron, go ahead.
Okay, so good morning to everyone. So I'm Kerry Mitchell, as earlier presented, and I'm one of the co-authors for Chapter 1, one of the coordinating authors, along with Jonathan. And our chapter is an introduction chapter. It really introduces the NEA here in Grenada, and as we can see from the title on the screen, it helps set the scene on how an NEA can help contribute to some of the improvements we can make in decision making. So we can go ahead with the first slide, the next slide. So one of the overarching approaches that are going to be used in this NEA really highlights the fact that in countries like Grenada, which would be categorized as a small island developing state, we do have a unique set of circumstances. In general, throughout the globe, small island developing states are considered to be biodiversity hotspots. In fact, they contain some 8.5% of the world's population, but they contain quite a significant bit of biodiversity. But in addition to this, they're also very vulnerable to extreme natural events. Now, we know that many of these extreme natural events are being exaggerated or exacerbated by the effect anthropogenic activity has on the climate. However, small island developing states contribute very little to the global carbon emissions which are associated with this exaggeration of natural events. But every year, small island developing states and other countries within the tropical and pantropical region of the planet are subject to tropical cyclones. Small island development states notably are also typically associated with active volcanoes. And many of these circumstances increase the risk sensitivity of these SIDS and really pose significant risks to their ability to use their natural resources more effectively. And we know that many of these small countries, these small island developing states, have significant dependence on resources that come from from ecosystems, that are very susceptible to some of these natural events. So we depend a lot on coastal and marine resources, and of course these are inherently affected by natural events. What are some of the other challenges SIDS would face? Well, we have small populations, we have high energy and infrastructure costs. So this all results in a situation where we have limited disaster resilience. So it really seems unfair in some instances that we contribute the least, some can say, to global carbon emissions, but at the same time, we are even more significantly impacted by the effects of climate change. All right, so next slide, please. So this helps us really highlight the importance of taking stock. You know, this national ecosystems assessment process is very important because it helps us take stock of, you know, what we have. One of the key things it's going to do in terms of informing is it helps us be more efficient at scaling adaptation and mitigation measures. It's important to note that an NEA is nationally driven. So of course we are going to, you know, pull expertise from the local population, as Natalie would have mentioned in her introductory remarks. But because Grenada's NEA is unique as being the first in this part of the world, in the Caribbean, we are also going to need to pull expertise from other countries, other Caribbean countries, and even abroad. And this enhanced capacity now helps us, you know, improve our intentions to scale the measures that we would be taking from some of the larger countries. Because we must admit that many of the adaptation and mitigation measures are designed by and for larger and more developed countries. So to fit the needs of small island developing states, some significant scaling would be needed. But in addition to this, we are going to have the opportunity now to identify current environmental challenges. We're also going to be able to identify future environmental challenges. And this now gives us the tools to start making more environmentally sustainable policies that can help improve our resilience. A very notable benefit from this exercise is the transferable knowledge that will be obtained that would help other countries in the region carry out their NEAs. And this again was mentioned by Natalie in her introductory remarks. Being the first island, we are going to learn a lot of lessons, and these lessons can definitely be, you know, the outcome of these can certainly be used as we carry out NEAs throughout the region. Next slide, please. So an overarching concept in this NEA would be the focus on ecosystem services. And in fact, this is going to be heavily focused on in subsequent chapters. But this overarching concept is, you know, taking a view of the conservation of ecosystems as being absolutely necessary for the continual provisioning of benefits to human society. You know, as a concept, ecosystem services helps us understand the value of ecosystems to humans, the value of preserving ecosystems. So by placing this economic value on environmental and social impacts, we now have an improved chance of, you know, taking the anthropogenic impacts on our environment into account when we're making decisions. See, and if we look on this slide, we see that we try to, you know, create three distinct categories. You know, we have our direct services, if we were to look at environment ecosystem services from this perspective, and by these we refer to, you know, the provision of fresh food, clean water, fuel, medicine, and these are quite, you know, easily understood. We appreciate these direct services that the ecosystem provides. The one that certainly presents a challenge would be the indirect services. And you know, we're talking about climate regulation, disease regulation, water purification. You know, from the perspective of this chapter, what we're saying is that these ecosystem services can be considered regulating ecosystem services. So these are the services that maintain the environmental conditions that support life. And what's notable, and this is drawn upon in this introductory chapter, is that these services are typically viewed as invisible or silent until they no longer provide the service they need to provide efficiently. So focus would be placed on highlighting the importance of taking an ecological approach to policy making. So we don't, you know, ignore these indirect services, or we don't, you know, ensile aspects of economic and social policy as separate from biodiversity conservation. No, we put them together, see? Because this is considered our regulating ecosystem services, and this would now help us identify, you know, more benefits and at least continue to assess the the resources that would be needed to ensure that these services are properly maintained. And finally, not least, but definitely something that needs to be mentioned, our ecosystem services also provide cultural services. And we're talking about the spiritual, the aesthetic, the education, all of these ancillary services that we sometimes overlook when we're making our decisions. All right, next slide, please. So in many of the persons involved in this exercise certainly can be considered academics. But one of the focuses of this exercise, this NEA, is to try to mainstream this matter of ecosystem services. A core requirement of this mainstreaming process is to ensure that all of the goals and targets that we know to be important for biodiversity conservation are taken into account into the different policy areas throughout governments. So in this national ecosystems assessment, we are going to focus on 3 key areas. One, we're going to focus on the general governance challenges that we face in Grenada. At the same time, we're going to focus on some of the representative accomplishments and shortcomings that we would have had to face. And finally, we're going to highlight the potential that Grenada has for mainstreaming biodiversity and building resilience. And this would certainly, again, help us, we're touching on this topic of resilience, but this is important because it helps us to now highlight, ways that we can be able to adapt when we face some of the extreme events that we mentioned in that earlier slide. But what will be the outcome of all of this? Well, it will help balance, the trade-off amongst competing priorities. Governments have to make decisions. They have priorities, and priorities may sometimes be placed more on socioeconomic benefits, ignoring, some of the issues associated with environmental conservation. But of course, the objective of this national ecosystems assessment would be to show that these are connected. They cannot be ignored one from the other. But importantly, we're also going to have an opportunity to interact with local communities, because these local communities have an inherent interest in conserving natural resources, because their longevity, their ability to thrive depends on the health of these ecosystems. So mainstreaming our ecosystem services, making it more palatable to non-specialists or non-scientists, is certainly going to be a major focus in this exercise. Next slide, please. So I have mentioned this matter of resilience a few times in the previous slides, and this is another area that's going to be highlighted throughout the National Ecosystem Assessment. And in this chapter, we define it as an introductory chapter, and we're going with the definition, coined by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And basically, resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb change and to keep functioning. This is crucial. This exercise is crucial. This NEA is crucial in our attempt to build resilience. Why? Because when we look at the threats that Grenada faces, certainly we can appreciate the need to be able to adapt, or at least absorb change, because there are changes. We're faced with hurricanes and other extreme weather events. We have 2 volcanoes in Grenada, one quite active marine volcano. We periodically have tremors, which it can be indicative of worsening situations in the future. And of course, we're dealing with some of the other issues associated with socioeconomic growth. For example, our population is growing, albeit slowly, but it is growing. Our GDP would likely grow with this increased population. As we come out of the pandemic, a lot of focus and attention is going to be placed on some of the economic activities in Grenada, including tourism, notably. And all of these come with significant impacts on our natural environment. So we can appreciate that change is happening. The objective, of course, is to ensure that Grenada's ecosystems can be resilient to that change, absorb the change, but continue functioning, continue providing the services that we expected to provide. And one thing that's notable in this chapter is we will place quite a bit of emphasis on socioeconomic resilience. And we're going to focus our attention on how this socioeconomic resilience can be achieved through appropriate infrastructure planning, where governments and individuals would put measures in place to ensure that there's sufficient redundancy. So if we are to face a natural disaster as we did, 18 years ago, we can continue functioning, and our ecosystems can continue provisioning their services. All right, so I'll hand you over now to my colleague who will continue discussing some of these key points from our first chapter.
Thank you, Kerry. Next slide, please. Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present. I really appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this process. And the next point that we make in chapter 1 has to do with the overarching perspective of the NEA. And in this slide, I would call your attention to the highlighted phrases at the top: democratic approach, knowledge sharing, and work to the benefit of local and regional communities, or summarized as building capacity through relationships and memberships. The descriptions and the explanations that we provide in this first chapter reflect the guidance of the UN Environmental Program, World Conservation Monitoring Center, and as Natalie pointed out earlier, also IPBES, as well as the academic literatures that all the contributing authors in this chapter are quite familiar with, and some of us have actually contributed to. Literatures that emphasize the benefits of being inclusive in this kind of study to make it truly useful in the kind of integrative and mainstreaming way that Kerry just described to you. And we point out that inclusivity means both the empowerment of communities to have substantive input into policy decisions that affect them, and the full consideration of the information that comes from local, indigenous, and traditional knowledge about ecosystems and species, because this is information that comes from long histories of lived experiences. Also, we want to make sure that the NEA is informed by the notion that inclusivity is not a matter of one-off encounters, but the building of relationships through formal institutions and formal memberships, but also through networks, both formal and informal. Next slide, please. We include in the chapter a pretty careful accounting of the multilateral environmental agreements, that is, the international agreements, treaties, and protocols that Grenada is a member of, and suggesting some that in the interest of biodiversity conservation, Grenada might join. So the chapter has a rather long and inclusive table of listing these agreements. So what we want to point out in the chapter with this information is that there are benefits, but some complications, but mostly that in addition to the local human resources and sources of knowledge coming from locally and regionally, that international relationships are also important. As Kerry's noted, many of the methods of biodiversity conservation and the policies and international agreements that foster them are designed by larger countries to be implemented at larger scales than is appropriate for small island states. So methods and data, while possibly useful coming out of these big agreements, need to be scaled down for island size applications. So MEAs are important resources, and chapter 1 offers a comprehensive table of them, as I mentioned, along with suggestions for other memberships. Next slide, please. In considering the advantages of MEA membership, we identify, as noted here, Grenada's biodiversity goals and strategies, how they are or could be included into those MEAs, the importance of regular attendance at meetings to share norms and exchange knowledge. And I might emphasize that third bullet point to gain access to financial support, and following on to that, technology transfers as well. So MEAs, the negotiations that create them, and the conferences of the parties that follow their ratification provide the opportunity for small island states to learn from each other, to form alliances through organizations such as the Association of Small Island States, for example, to advocate for the special attention that islands deserve, both in terms of appropriate data and scaled down approaches, and for the transfer of resources for protecting biodiversity locally, regionally, and those that exist in SIDS like Grenada that are of global importance. Next slide, please. The diagram in this slide shows some of the already rich architecture of organizations and institutions at the regional level, that is, in the wider Caribbean, that can provide the resources and relationships that Grenada alone may not have access to, that will create economies of scale, shared resources, region-wide strategies, programs, and projects. I would also note the inclusion of local educational institutions highlights the role of Grenada's and the wider Caribbean's educational systems as places for doing the appropriate research and teaching that locally relevant research on biodiversity conservation, and also as institutions with added capacity for implementing Grenada's obligations under multilateral environmental agreements and implementing programs and projects funded by external sources. And most importantly, for building the locally trained and oriented human capital needed to accomplish the goals of mainstreaming and optimizing the ecosystem services achievable through effective national policies. Also, by including in this diagram civil society organizations, we point back to things that were presented to you so eloquently by Sandra and Natalie and John Agard in their introductory remarks. We point out the importance of self-organization, bottom-up participation for inclusion of those stakeholders in decisions that affect their livelihoods, and the transmission of indigenous and local and traditional knowledge to make sure it's fully integrated into any decision-making processes, and it establishes, Sandra discussed, these robust two-way conversations and effective communication links between local stakeholders, national and regional level decision makers. Next slide, please. So, to sum up, this slide presents the four main goals of Chapter 1, which you have seen in the executive summary that was shared with you. And we will admit that this presentation claims a lot for the contribution and the value of this NEA, keeping in mind that the purpose of this first chapter is to set the stage. We've tried to describe the importance of this project, if used as a resource by policymakers, and the general methods that inform the work done for the substantive chapters that follow this first chapter that Carrie and I have had the privilege of being the CLAs for. Those chapters take on all of the issues relevant to biodiversity conservation in small island developing states, with a focus on the particular needs of Grenada. Finally, if I can highlight point 4 in this slide, it indicates that Chapter 1 provides some baseline information on aspects of Grenada's economy, society, political structures. The chapter is already too long, so we don't give an absolutely detailed and comprehensive account, but hopefully an indicative one of those structures and processes at national, regional, and international levels, and an inventory of the educational institutions that may further the work. Also, this chapter, like the others, has an extensive bibliography indicating the sources used in the chapter, and also where more complete information on all of these relevant topics can be found. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Carrie. That was a very good interview. And as they've indicated, Chapter 1 sets the context for the rest of the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. And if you all are very excited about what you heard, you are welcome to become a reviewer on Chapter 1. We will be sending out requests, and you will have access to the entire chapter where you can provide detailed comments. At this time, though, if you all have any initial thoughts, please go ahead and do so. We have a few minutes in plenary if you all have any questions for our coordinating lead authors or for any of the secretariat or anything on this chapter, please let us know. And it's fine if you don't, because they did a fantastic job and it is an introductory chapter. We expect more comments on chapter 2. So if anybody has anything that they would like to say at this time. Joseph, hi. Friends of the Earth, are you going to comment?
Yeah, I just want I think the first speaker, maybe, I can't remember if it's the second speaker. So just elaborate a little more on the ecological approach to policy making also, because very often we confuse environment with ecology, which the two words can be, I mean, ecology to me is much wider than environment. Environmental and environment is really basically responding to the capitalist system. Thanks.
Okay, I don't know if Carrie, would you go ahead?
Yeah. Hi, thanks. That's a very good comment. And in fact, I think that's one of the approaches the chapter would take. We want to transcend just looking at the environment. It's a complete socio-ecological approach, because that is all purpose of assessing the ecosystems and providing an economic valuation of the ecosystem. So the approach really is a socio-ecological approach that we're taking in the chapter, and I think throughout the NEA itself.
So just to elaborate a little further, Joseph, so chapter 1 again sets the context. Chapter 2, which we'll do a presentation on shortly, lays out a lot of the information regarding status and trends. The other chapters look at climate impacts, provides actual valuation, both in terms of economic and other forms of value of these ecosystems. But we also have a policy chapter, where those authors will be taking the information from the previous chapters and trying to make policy recommendations based on all of that ecological information. So I hope that answers your question. Do we have any other questions or comments? No? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up and I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So with that, I will thank our coordinating lead authors of chapter 1. Thank you very much. Oh, Chris, sorry, Chris has her hands up. Chris, go ahead. You might be muted, Chris.
Yes, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. I just wanted to say how pleased I am to hear you saying right at the very beginning, or somebody was saying, that you're going to put things into a language that people can use to influence policymakers. I think that would be, that is so innovative in the Caribbean, and I think it would be extremely useful for us here, particularly at this time. So I really support that notion.
Okay, but just to point out, Chris was one of the people in the first set of meetings who actually demanded this. So there was actually an initial meeting with civil society where Canary was giving very strong instructions. Please make sure that there are communication products that civil society can use rather than a long, complicated report. So Chris, I am happy to report that we are actively doing that. And as per my presentation, we've actually sourced external funding to support that product.
I'm just glad that I feel like, you know, we are being listened to. I think that's why I wanted to put something in there.
If I could just add something to that briefly, Chris, thank you for that comment.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, you just heard from 2 university professors, and I can guarantee you that Canary and our co-authors are holding us to task on that and making sure that what we present is comprehensible to anyone who has an interest in reading it.
Okay. Great. ICA Joyce? Oh.
Yes, Natalie, my question has to do with the practical use of the chapters, and I know this is chapter 1, but I know chapter 1 is kind of giving guidance to the rest of the chapters. So I wanted to find out how useful the NEA is going to be for the SIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. I know it's intended for policy and so, but would it have, is that a consideration? I'm just asking, because, you know, at the end of the day, you want to be able to, I know about the value of the information. So I just wanted to know whether that was a consideration.
I can perhaps answer that, Jonathan Carey. So it is supposed to be an up-to-date report of status and trends of the ecosystem. So I know the Environment Division wants to heavily use this document for national reporting, for NEAs and so forth. So with that said, given that it is looking to provide a comprehensive, up-to-date assessment of ecosystems and ecosystem resources, it should be able to also supply information in terms of people trying to do EIAs, ESIAs, and so forth, because that is the intent. That is what the Environment Division keeps emphasizing to us, that they want this document in a shape that they can be used for national reports to, for example, CBD and so forth. So if we're going to try and go to that depth, then surely it must also be good enough to assist with EIAs and so forth. Is that okay?
Yes, Natalie, thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry, I muted myself. Not seeing any more hands. Okay, all right, and we are doing excellent in terms of time. I do want to give you all a 5-minute break. Please go get some coffee, you know, take a little walk and a stretch. I know all we do these days is just sit down and look at computer screens. We're gonna come back at 10:15, at which point we will do the presentation on chapter 2, which is the main status and trends document. And I will introduce the speakers before they begin their presentation. Okay, so thanks everybody, and you're off the hook for 5 minutes. Please come back. Thanks.
ecosystem services are generally ignored in large policy and developmental decisions. This threatens long-term sustainability and development. This is largely because the value of these ecosystem services, such as the value of a mangrove protecting a shoreline, are generally not understood and poorly elaborated. This National Ecosystem Assessment aims to provide policymakers with clear information on the value of these ecosystem services so that they can include biodiversity considerations into their decision-making processes.
What's important about the participatory approach is that it starts in a very simple manner and in a way that includes all through an important consensus building process. And based upon that, then, we govern ourselves until everyone is satisfied with the product, knowing the shared outcome that you are looking for, and in that context, everyone has a stake in it. So, Canary is very strong at using a participatory approach, which makes sure that everyone can come to the table and has an opportunity to have a voice, like fishermen, like the farmers, like the water taxi men, etc., in order to make sure that they understand what it means and elucidate from them what would be key priorities for them. What does this mean? It means that it becomes sustainable. can cause. But over in the next 10 years, we could have loss of biodiversity like plant extinction and animal extinction.
In Wynwood, there's a reef system that used to be there. It's largely collapsed and dead, and as a result, when we have northerly swells coming in, you're getting a lot more wave impact coming into the town and into the beach of Hillsborough. So the things that we're saying are the impacts if nothing changes. Well, in 10 years' time, there will be no beach in Hillsborough. It'll wash away.
How do you depend on your country's ecosystem?
Well, for me, I mainly depend on the marine ecosystem in my country because I'm a fisherman, and the resources that the marine ecosystem provide me with a livelihood, and not just me, but it provides myself and people on the island with, food security.
The assessment will explore how these ecosystems and related ecosystem services contribute to climate resilience, the national economy, and human well-being. The assessment will pay particular attention to the value of genetic resources across different ecosystems, in particular the island's agricultural ecosystems. These focal areas will provide the data that the government officials have identified as important to support the development, revision, and implementation of key national policies. The assessment's findings will also support the management of ecosystems and resources crucial to the livelihoods and well-being of Grenadians. Grenada's National Ecosystem Assessment will be completed in 2023 using the strong participatory approach used in this scoping exercise. In doing so, the assessment will be by Grenadians for Grenadians, reflecting the priorities of both governmental and non-governmental stakeholders.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. Hope you all got a good cup of coffee, etc. So we're going to start with chapter 2, which is where a lot of the information that we want feedback on is concentrated. I think this is the most important chapter in terms of stakeholder feedback. So I believe Jody is presenting first. So over to you, Jody.
So thank you for that introduction. And as Natalie said before, I'm one of the CLAs on chapter 2. And in this chapter, we cover very broadly status, strengths, threats to Grenada's coastal, deep ocean, forests, freshwater, offshore, and agricultural ecosystems. So it's a pretty comprehensive chapter, a bunch of text to go through. So Dr. Hannah and Dr. Deacon would go into a little bit more detail on past environments and freshwater ecosystems. But for the other sections in the chapter, I'm going to stay high level because it's a lot of information we've covered in each section. So you can go to the next slide. So first up, we'll have Dr. Hannah, who will talk about past environments.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to present this. So I'm Jonathan Hannah. I'm an environmental archaeologist, and I was tasked with putting together sort of the massive background to everything else in the chapter, sort of how the environment came to be over millions of years. So looking at geology, sea level, some of the megafauna that were around and went extinct, and then the arrival of humans, European colonization, and then post-emancipation period. So it's a lot. So I'm also staying high level. Geologically, Grenada, usually we say the Lesser Antilles emerged about 60 million years ago. There's some sedimentary evidence of a little earlier. Most of the volcanics tend to be about 14 million years ago, and that's the oldest for Grenada. Most of the surface geology in Grenada, though, is less than 2 million years, so in the Pleistocene epoch. One of the threats, we mentioned 2 volcanoes earlier. There's actually 3 active volcanoes. I don't know if we're missing Isle de Caye. So Kikimjeni, Isle de Caye, and Mount St. Catherine are all considered live still, although Kikumjeni is the real threat. Lake Antoine and Granatang are, crater lakes. Granatang formed about 20,000 years ago, and Lake Antoine about 10,000 years ago, based on some coring, which I'll talk about in a second. Generally, like the size of the land, which was impacted by volcanics, is also impacted by sea level, and so the rise and fall of sea level has affected the landmass itself. And most of the time, the last several million years, I lost my lost my screen. Most of the last several million years, sea level has been lower, although there's been a few exceptions where it was way higher than today. But most of the time it was lower, and even about 120 meters lower than today, just in the last glacial maximum, which was about 20 to 25,000 years ago. So Grenada was part of a much larger landmass, larger, about the size of Puerto Rico, extending from about 30 meters south of Point Celine all the way to the Beckaway Channel. So all the Grenadines, everything was connected as one big island. And so that supported some larger megafauna during the last ice age. So we have, we didn't have mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, but we had ground sloths, giant sloths, primates. You had giant capybaras and giant rice rats, stuff like that. That there's actually direct evidence of them in Grenada, especially mudstone from Point Celine. And then there's sort of indirect evidence from other islands based on these animals are present. So these other like predators, such as giant owls and things like that, are likely present as well. A lot of these went extinct as sea level grew and the landmass was reduced, and then climate changed pretty dramatically. It was fairly dry in the Pleistocene, and then turned to a more mesic or wet environment at the turn of the Holocene about 10,000 years ago. And that's also when humans began arriving. And so the last remnants of some of the larger animals, their extinction corresponds mostly with the arrival of humans, but not because of direct hunting, most likely some collateral impacts like deforestation and things. On this image on the left, these graphs are they're based on lake cores from like Lake Antoine, Levera, also Meadow Beach wetlands. And so at the top on the green graph on the left, that's these cores captured sort of the last remnants of like the ancient arboreal, the ancient forest of Grenada. So that declined about 5,000 years ago and never really rebounded. Seems correlated to some volcanic activity, but also humans are showing up at this time. There's some limited evidence for the arrival of humans, mostly through pollen and phytoliths. We don't have a lot of direct materials from this time. It's really about 180 when human population starts expanding and you get actual settlements. But this earlier period, you also have the arrival of some introduced species, especially plants, but you also get some animals that may have been brought in at this time, or definitely by the later ceramic period. You get a few of these animals, things like agouti and opossum, we believe were introduced by Amerindians. Like dogs and rice rats follow, so the non-native rice rats, and then tons of plants. Early on, you get avocado and a lot of root crops, and then by the ceramic age, you're getting things like potatoes and corn, pineapple and soursop, a lot of things we associate with Amerindians. So the arrival of humans about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago does correspond to some of these large-bodied animals going extinct, but it's not until European arrival, that you get another major extinction event, and then this time it's like small-bodied animals. And again, it's not direct hunting; it's mostly collateral damage. Of course, lots of deforestation occurring, massive changes to the environment during the colonial period, but also introduced species. So you get mongoose and new types of dogs, cats, all these, cattle. So you get all these, sheep and goats and horses, and big changes to the land. You also get black rats replace all of the rice rats, and so you get things moving into these niches and pushing out native species. And then during the colonial period, you also have all the deforestation, you have massive burnings. There's some big fires and like insect infestations, like sugar ants at one point almost make it inhabitable. The big hurricane in 1780, and then the Fedon Rebellion. So you have a lot. The landscape takes a pretty big hit during the colonial period, and it's. I think there are probably some old growth forests. I'm not sure what studies have been done to identify them, but there's probably a few areas in the Central Mountains that have some old growth, but otherwise it's all regrowth from like the rebound from the colonial period. In the post-emancipation period, you had some different changes. So you go from monocropping, mostly sugarcane, and then that fails, and you get all these other new crops, cocoa and coffee and things like that. And then also the former enslaved mostly opt out of the economy. Many people just continue to work on plantations for wages, but a lot of people also just move out to the mountains and just become sustainable subsistence farming. So you get the expansion of West Indian gardens, and these are today a really diverse ecosystem service to many insects and birds. But in the sort of labor shortage, then we have a new group, the Indian indentured, brought in, and so some new impacts, mostly perhaps an oversized influence on Caribbean cuisine, and this is sort of the crucible of Grenadian culture today. I mean, the end of the 19th century is like one of the most interesting periods for just what we think of Grenadian culture today, and it's all happening around that time. The Indian indenture is sort of the last puzzle piece to that. But there's still big estates, and the island is carved out by estates, and that is maintained until the 1950s, until Gary. And so plantocracy isn't really broken down until then. But then there's a lot of sort of corruption and mishandling, sort of crashes the agricultural sector. A lot of lands are given away for residential instead of agriculture or small holding. And the agricultural sector never really recovers to those earlier levels. The Revo, introduced a lot of reforms and reinvestments, and then that was continued with things like the model farm projects. But the same problems are today, especially infrastructure, the biggest barriers to Grenada's food security today. I mean, like, land is more valuable as real estate than agriculture or as sort of natural capital. So yeah, so these are some of the sort of ecological history that leads to the current status and trends that go on in the rest of the chapter.
Thanks. So right, as Jonathan covered, we got a really extensive history of Grenada from the start, and then Grenada up until a more recent history. So the chapters, the next thing we talk about is the status of ecosystems currently. Well, as current as we can be, because we have a lot of limited data. So I am so sorry. So the first thing we covered was under the agricultural ecosystems, and some may argue, why did we group that as an ecosystem? I'm so sorry. the thought we had at the time is that you may have like some areas that are highly used for poultry and livestock, and you have areas that may be somewhat agroforest. So they're talking about nutmeg and mixed with agriculture, as well as cropland. And we do have varying use of both native and introduced fauna in there. And so we decided to group it in there because there is some ecosystem services provided by them. So generally on agroforest, we're talking about nutmeg and mixed with agriculture. I mean, kind of chronicle shifts from um, short crops into use of more the nutmeg and cocoa and such. And we also talk a bit about some of the fauna we find using these spaces. Only work we could really come across would be that specifically for birds. So there was work done, surveys done in 2020 by Williams, and he was just really comparing bird diversity around Grenada, and he did find that particularly nectivorous species are often associated with these agroforest areas. And another study by Sayre had showed that there are particular when birds are using these habitats, so maybe even urban habitats as well as agroforested habitat, they would oftentimes modify their songs. So there is confirmation they're using these spaces and they have adaptations that allow them to thrive there. And finally, the only other fauna we could really have published work on is obviously Mona monkeys. So we just talk a bit about their use of the space, and even from Grooms in the 1970s, talking about them raiding agricultural areas. And on the poultry and livestock, we talk a bit about just Grenada's poultry and livestock industry. We relied on some information from the Ministry of Agriculture. Most of it was from informal interviews and some informal interviews. You also had individuals who are in the poultry and livestock industry. I'm just covered just generally, like, you have individuals who may be using chickens and ducks and so on, and some may be using them for the purpose of meat extraction, others for eggs. And we briefly talk about the livestock industry as well. So we stay very high level there with the data we have available. I can go to the next slide. So under the coastal ecosystems, we group here mangrove, seagrass beds, and coral reefs. So this figure you're seeing here, I'm just showing you the distribution of mangrove, seagrass beds, and coral reefs in Grenada. And these data are coming largely from recent work by TNC. So mangroves, we talk about the different vegetation communities you find. We talk a bit about the birds that use the space. We also talk about some of the associated marine fauna you may find there. In seagrass bed, we chronicle the same, and we do the same with coral reefs. And from extending from coral reefs, we go broadly talking about a little bit about the fishing industry, but we're mostly talking about coastal fisheries. We also talk a bit about instances when we have like closed and open season with some species, for example, with sea urchins. And we then go into talk, if we go to the next slide, and we then go into the deep ocean, which you're finding more further. Can we go to deep ocean, the next slide? So then we go into deep ocean, and deep ocean, we're not looking at nearshore ecosystems anymore. And so that section was done by Dr. By Diva Eamon. And we chronicle a bit about what you would find out there. We had a big focus on Kick and Jenny because there's a lot of unique fauna you would find there, a lot of invertebrates that may be using that space. And we also talk about seabirds because obviously seabirds are using these deep ocean areas. And then we finally wrap up with marine mammals, and we give a bit of chronicle of what we've known about the marine mammals in Grenada's waters and past trends in catch and how they changed over time. So that's kind of high level what we covered on the deep ocean. So we can go to the next slide because I want to give Dr. Deacon enough time. So the next section we go into is we chronicle Grenada's forests. Most of the way in which we discuss Grenada's forest is influenced by Baird 1949. And you may ask why we're using such an old resource. This is because this has been the most extensive, firstly, and the way in which we classify vegetation within the tropics and the Caribbean is largely influenced by Baird's work. So from 1949, you have Baird doing these extensive surveys across the region. And then from Baird's work, we have mainly through US Forest Service in Puerto Rico, they build on that to create some different forest classification systems. But really, if you focus on them, they are just a refinement of the classes that Baird talks about. So Baird is really the primary resource when we're talking about forest classification in the region. But his work is the most recent extensive survey we've had of Grenada's forest. So while we've had various land cover maps, as we show here, this one from a World Bank project in 2015, I believe. These are really, they're taking satellite imagery oftentimes, and they are doing some sort of image classification with some ground truthing to determine what land cover, land use types you may have. But none of them are looking really into the specifics of which vegetation communities you would find, meaning what plants you would find there, where are they located, how they may be differing. And so because of this lack of information and lack of more recent inventory of Grenada's forest, we had to rely largely on Baird's work. And so generally we group the forest into eight major classes. So dry scrub, we then talk broadly about the subclasses under that. So those are areas that are largely influenced by their coastal, and because of limitations in precipitation, they tend to be a drier type of forest, and you go more inland into what we would consider true like Caribbean tropical forest, rainforests. And then finally, we talk about the upper montane forest, which is where you would find in places like Fedon and Mount St. Catherine and such. And we did note too, like building on Dr. Hannah's work, Baird did confirm as well that in Grenada's forest, much of the forests up until maybe the lower mountain, which is transitioning between to the rainforest to upper mountain, would have been modified because of cultivation. And he did see a lot of evidence of secondary forests. So you have these forests that were areas that were previously cultivated, and now you see they're transitioning into secondary rainforests. And eventually, if with time, you would see them show the typical characteristics of what we would consider to be the rainforest class. So that's just broadly what we covered on a Baird. We also, besides talking about the plants themselves, we talk about the biota, obviously. So we group them by birds. We talk about birds, amphibians, and reptiles, as well as mammals. So broadly on the mammals, we're talking about the opossums and the Mona monkeys, all the research that's detailed there. One I would mention specifically, Mona monkey, as you may know, introduced from Sao Tome about 300 years ago. It's believed that they are the result of one pregnant female. And unlike with other populations where you typically see if you start with low genetic diversity, a crash, there was something interesting that happened with Grenada Mona monkeys where all the concerning genetic abnormalities were actually purged out of the population. So while they may be genetically similar, they are doing pretty well because there was a small population that was not hunted at the time of introduction. So they were given time to basically sustain themselves or survive. So they had low hunting pressure and they had enough habitat in order for them to use. We also talk about the bats that are found here as well. And yeah, we have the inventory in there. We have the inventory as appendices, but we just talk broadly about all of the work done there. I should also mention one group that we had a bunch of information to use would be on birds, because there has been some more recent work done on birds in Grenada. And I can mention though that a recent study, I think by the Corpo Lab, was pointing out that we do have our own species of house wren here, has its own distinct genetics and call and so on. So that's just really interesting things that came out in our readings. So now I'm just going to transfer over to Amy on the next slide, who talk a bit about freshwater ecosystems.
Great, thanks very much, Jodie. So yeah, freshwater leads on nicely from forest because I mean they're completely interconnected really, and a lot of Grenada's freshwater habitats they begin in the forests in those upland areas and of course below down, and then you also have the lakes as well. You could go to the next slide. Yeah. So it's the freshwater habitats consist of a lot of rivers and streams, starting with those small ones coming down mountains, and then there's a few notable what we call lentic habitats, in other words, standing water, lakes and ponds. The really large ones like Grenada, and then smaller ponds in different places, as well as some geothermal streams. So that would all be covered in this part of the in chapter 2, thinking about what species are living in there in particular. So yeah, we can move to the next slide. So it was quite a challenge to do an inventory and sort of bring together information on the diversity of these habitats. There wasn't a huge amount of data that I was able to find. So I am really keen if anyone here today even is, you know, is able to fill some gaps or correct anything in that respect. So we did do as comprehensive as possible search of the literature and other sources. And that came up with about 19 fishes living in the freshwater habitats. Now, quite a few of these are actually you'd think of as marine fish, but they do use the freshwater habitats at different life stages. So we included them because they're still going to be affected by anything happening to those freshwater ecosystems. There are also quite a few notable exotics, including guppies and other live-bearing fish and tilapia, just to name a couple. There are plenty of crustaceans, and these are mostly, I think all of them, in fact, are freshwater shrimps. So the macrobrachium is the scientific name, but they're the larger freshwater shrimps. There's a picture of one here at the bottom next to the frog. Several mollusks, including at least one invasive mollusk, freshwater mollusk, and then only one native amphibian, which actually, which is the Grenada frog here, tree frog, but it actually doesn't really use the freshwater habitats as central to its cycle. It's like some frogs, but we included it here because, you know, amphibians do still rely on water, and there are several exotic amphibians as well. So you might recognize some of these species on the left. So these are three of the freshwater fishes that actually are primarily freshwater fishes. They're not going out into the sea. So this top one we're really interested in. This is a very large specimen of a Cystidium goby, which I believe might be known as tree. There probably are some other names as well, referring to the same species. I'm really interested in this because there's some evidence and some descriptions of it being harvested in large numbers, and we know on other islands it is harvested in huge numbers. This species, its larvae goes out to sea and then it migrates back up the river when it's young, and then it spends its adult life in the freshwater habitats. But it's in that smaller life stage as it's migrating up. It's very easy to catch and you can fry it up. And I couldn't find anything to really say whether that's still happening and to what extent that might have impacted this habitat in the past. So hopefully in the breakout session, somebody might be able to shed some light on that. Then below that, we have the swamp eel, Symbrancus, and then this is a mountain mullet below that. So they should all be common species from those freshwater habitats. Yeah, so that's my summary really of the freshwater part of the report. So yeah, back to you, Jodie.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So the final ecosystem we'll cover, and I'll try to make sure it's as brief as possible since we have the threats and gaps in turn to cover, would be offshore islands. And our thought here is that while offshore islands they typically have, like, that's a similar transition you'd find on the main island. Like, for instance, you find your coral reefs followed by seagrass beds, followed by mangroves. And then you typically have your coastal forests. They are somewhat unique because many of them are uninhabited, and because they are often not getting that increase in elevation you'd find on the mainland, you find that many of the organisms or fauna that use these spaces typically experience a slightly different environment than those you would find on the larger mainland of Grenada, even Carrick to some degree. So we did focus on offshore islands there, and then this is just showing you a figure, locations of work done by Coffee of just areas they've found and been able to detect the use of seabirds across Carrick largely, Carrick and Pittimatnik, and then the offshore islands like Sugarloaf, Green Island, Sandy Island, etc. So we can go to the next slide. The next section we had was trends, and we really had to rely on spatial data. While I think Dr. Hannah had mentioned some of the trends we had seen, for instance, when we had the breaking up of the plantocracy and some people moving out into the mountains to do like this somewhat typical West Indian garden. We really had to get to do something a bit more comprehensive. We had to rely on spatial data. So we do the comparisons based on the source of the information, and that was for one main reason. The method used to generate those land cover data were slightly different. So from 1980 to 2009, we're looking at data that was generated by Grenada's Land Use Division. And what they did is they took aerial imagery and they did some manual classifications of land cover classes, and then they did some, they went into the field to verify whether those classifications were correct. Now, when we're transitioning from 2000 to 2014, however, we're looking at satellite imagery. And what they did is they used some high-res satellite imagery. They did some image classification in GIS, and they did some ground truthing to verify them. But the methods used are slightly different. And because the methods used are slightly different, you could have an instance. Let's say you're looking at an area in the north of the island, for instance, over 1 acre of land. Under the manual digitization, you'd find like areas that may have mixed use. So let's say you have some agricultural lands mixing with some urban spaces, mixing with some cropland. They're likely to going to be grouped as the same land cover class. So the land cover class that dominates that acre is the one that's going to be classified largely. When we're having the satellite imagery, however, because the resolution is so much finer, we can capture a diverse level of habitat use or diverse land use within that space. So one might underestimate in other ways and the other would overestimate, so we decided to keep them separate. But generally, we're looking at broad trends. So using the land cover data from 1982 to 2009, and that's the ones in yellow, we're seeing an increase in roads and buildings. We're seeing increases in drought and deciduous, and marginal changes in forest classes, in some of the forest classes. Generally, it suggested a decline in like deciduous forest, for instance. But when we look at it 2008 to 2014, the consistent changes we see is it's a somewhat decline, increase in nutmeg and mixed with agriculture, a decline in pastures and cultivated lands, and that's just between 2004 and 2014 to note. And the changes in mangrove and wetland cover were pretty minimal between the both layers. But one thing I would like to point out before I move on is that you'd see a big disparity between both groupings in a shift from nutmeg to mixed with agriculture. You'd notice that one is suggesting that there was a decline of negative 1437, and the other one suggesting an increase. One thing we should note that these 1980 to 2009 is kind of covering a different transition in Grenada's land use, and we talked a bit about that shifting in the plantocracy. So we think that's what's captured here. So it's the layers may be disagreeing because they're showing you a shift generally over time. So that was a trend. So you can move to the next slide. And then we next covered, oh, did I have that doubly? Oh, threats. So I'll try to be very quickly with that. So these are the threats we cover under, we break up the threats into big groups. So we have diseases, we have habitat loss and degradation, we have, what was the other grouping? I can't see the bottom of the slide. So we have diseases, habitat loss and degradation, we had pollution, invasive species. I think those were the general groupings we had. So this is just a threat we covered on the habitat loss and degradation. So we're talking about a wide range of things: climate change impacts, deforestation, development, sand mining, storm and hurricanes, rainfall events, recreation and tourism, maritime vessels. So that section is quite extensive. I don't have sufficient time to go into the specifics of how we talk about it, but I can tell you broadly that under every section, we go a little bit into detail about how various ecosystems could be impacted based on the best available data. You can go to the next slide. We then have the next grouping, I believe. Under this here, we're talking about diseases here, and we cover some of the diseases that would have been detected with some of the fauna we found in both coastal and forest and terrestrial ecosystems. And go to the next slide. We then talk about invasive species. So some of the invasive species you'd find in all of these ecosystems, and we also gave a bit of an inventory of each. So we cover flora and fauna wherever relevant. We go into specifics when we can, and when we can't, we may not discuss it. And the reason why we have those 4 listed is because those were the ones we were able to find data for. Let me go to the next slide. So next we're going to pollution. So this is how we group pollution on the nutrient, sewage, industrial waste, and anthropogenic litter. All 4 having like meaningful impacts on ecosystems. But particularly we know that coastal and marine ecosystems, as well as freshwater ecosystems, are largely impacted by pollution. So that's one of the bigger focuses in this section. And we could go to the next slide. And then finally, we go on to overexploitation. And here we're broadly talking about instances where we've seen, based on the best available data, that there were changes, negative changes in the population viability of particular species because of direct human take. So that's broadly what we're capturing there, and we capture them under the respective ecosystems. And then finally, on to gaps, which is the final slide. As the name suggests, we are talking about what are the general gaps we found in collecting information. Obviously, one of the major threads throughout all of these ecosystems is the fact that we had a lot of difficulty sometimes finding recent information. So as I mentioned, in the case of forests, for example, the most recent inventory of Grenada's forests that we could find was from Baird in 1949, which is a long, long time ago. And while we have satellite data from satellite imagery, it cannot tell you information about which species you're finding and at what proportion. And different species mean differences in ecosystem complexity and height, which means different flora and fauna could be supported. So, and then in Baird's work, when he talked about there was a transition from secondary forests, like we can't comment on whether or not many of these forests have actually transitioned into typical, what we consider to be typical rainforest, because the most recent work was in 1949. We broadly across gaps we found was that general, we didn't have much information on consistent monitoring of fauna. So it was difficult to tell, apart for a few species like the Grenada dove, what the likely trajectory was, because we don't have consistent monitoring of the flora and fauna around Grenada. And that was consistent throughout our review. And this is why it made it difficult to sometimes hypothesize on potential impacts of, for example, things like climate change. We had some hypotheses about what could potentially happen, but because of the general gaps, it was very difficult to say specific, go into specifics because of the lack of consistent monitoring. And it's not covered here, but what this slide is followed by, what this section is followed by, is our appendix, which is gives you a bunch of tables upon tables upon tables of inventories of different biota you would find in Grenada, different flora you'd find in Grenada, by the various ecosystem types. So thank you very much for listening to what we had to share. I'm very sorry I was not able to go into very detail about the specifics of what we've done, but this is a big chapter with a lot of information in it. So we tried our best to stay high level, but also give you a good sense of what was covered. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jody. So I'm thinking how to frame this. And I'm thinking to say what we provided was a teaser, was a trailer. We need reviewers, as in people who would read through the actual chapter and provide detailed comments and feedback, in addition to more general comments that you all can send via email or through the chat here or in our breakout sessions that we'll do. So I know we haven't been able to present an entire amount of information, entire large body of information, but the actual chapters are available for review as well, in addition to us probing some specific issues within the breakout groups. At this time, we would like to open up the floor for some questions in plenary before we go back to our breakout groups. So sorry, questions and comments in plenary. So the floor is open, guys. We'll do this for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go into our breakout groups. I see one hand up. I'm sorry, it's not clear who's whose hand that is?
That's Joseph.
Oh, Joseph, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you
Joseph?
very much. Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to thank the presenters. I think this goes a long way in helping us to follow and understand what you folks are doing. If things were done like that, including like all the forest policy was done many years ago, we will have less problems. So I want to thank you first of all for that. But I also want to thank, there's some document, you say publication and publish. There's a document that people hardly talk about it, and I know one of the people on this call was either part of it or knows about it. And that is the Grenada Environmental Profile, which was done as part, I think, of the other, it was done for other islands too, by Island Foundation and some other agencies. Was that consulted or was that taken into account? And is there other documentation that was done? Like I know one time the World Bank commissioned some environmental action plan and all these kind of things. Have you looked at some of those stuff? You know, because there are a lot of stuff that maybe a lot of publication or unpublication could give you some insight. And also the work of Dr. Bonnie Ross on the Grenada government.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we did consult those documents. And one of the things that I'd like to highlight when we say limited in data availability, because we're covering status, the type of information we look for can be sometimes a bit more specific. So let's say we were looking at the Mona monkey, for instance. We're looking at where did it come from? What were the population trends over time? What are some genetic things that may have come about it? What are the things affecting it? And so sometimes while other documents, like let's say other documents, we mention them, this is specifics on framing what the status of that particular fauna is in Grenada is where the limitation sometimes was. So it's not that there may not things be mentioned, like for instance, the profile done on Grenada. When they talk about, let's say forest classes, they may give a larger estimate of there's X cover of this forest class and Y cover this forest class, but nothing has been as extensive from my reading of what Baird 1949 has, where he's mentioning specific species and proportions in specific areas and the state of the forest. And it's just more data that we can find more quantifiable to talk about the status of the ecosystem versus like something that gives us a general table that's a bit more broad. I don't know if that, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, in terms of the forestry, after Hurricane Ivan, there was some advice given why we never replanted or reforested. Have you come across any other literature that deal with any kind of communique or policy statement on that?
Well, we haven't, I'd say like from a policy perspective, that's not, has not been a particular focus on our chapter. We left that for other chapters to cover. I think maybe on Tuesday, I believe they may talk a bit more on policies here. We didn't focus, we focus on policy sometimes to help contextualize a trend that we see, but it wasn't really a focus of our chapter. We were really trying to chronicle what's there.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, so before I go to Terence, just to clarify, Joseph, yes, we do have a policy chapter. We're actually not doing that right now. The chapters on climate and valuation are being done on Tuesday. The policy chapter is operating a little behind because they actually now have to process all this information put together by the other chapters. So later on in the year, perhaps early next year, we'll get more into the policy aspects of this initiative. And great, thanks a lot, Joseph. Terence, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. Dr. Daniel, in your slide on pollution threats, sewage, would you care to just go into a little more detail on what exactly is covered by the term sewage? Thank you.
Yes, so when we spoke of sewage there, we were talking specifically, well, I guess in two ways. We talked about it from, well, broadly nutrients released into surface waters, some agriculture, some of them were captured in there, but also we talked about things that are coming sometimes from septic systems too. And then sometimes the landfall discharge was also broadly spoken to on the sewage.
Sorry, you mean the landfill, the sanitary landfill?
No. I shouldn't landfill, not landfill. I should have said there's an outfall. Sorry, I should have said sorry. I meant to say outfall.
Oh,
So
sorry, you said
outfall.
landfall. Yeah,
I meant to say outfall.
okay.
Sorry,
Yeah,
outfall.
this
Sewage
okay.
outfall as well.
Sewage outfalls. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you're referring to both septic systems as well as the Nawasa sewage outfalls.
Yeah, both are discussed there.
That's what I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Terrence. Am I seeing any more hands? Joseph, I think you're done. Sorry.
Sorry, we have a comment from Ingrid Lewis from way before. So
Aditi, please go ahead. Who has a comment that I'm not seeing?
So Ingrid Lewis says, does the report profile high North Forest in Carriacou? The white cedar trees is depleted and considered locally to be at risk due to its extensive use over the years in traditional boat building.
Okay. All right. So that's a good bit of info and a reference. So if anything, we'll pass that on to the authors. Thanks, Ingrid. That's useful. Paul, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning again. When the threats to ecosystems were mentioned, I didn't hear it, but what I think is a threat to ecosystems in the Grenadian context is the whole question of lack of information, lack of understanding of what an ecosystem is. As a result of that, well, if you do a survey, I know for a fact that if you do a survey presently and you ask many people what is an ecosystem, they would not be able to answer you. And as a result of that, they don't understand what are the functions of ecosystems. And as a result, they take everything for granted. And they don't pay the necessary attention to it, you know? And they don't understand that all the ecosystems have a particular function. They have a part to play in our own existence. And I think that that is an important thing to get on board in all of these things that I'm talking about. Because from my existence, I have been a civil servant for excess of 35, almost 40 years. And in my existence as a civil servant, I have done a lot of work on ecosystems, and I have experienced that if you go as far as the policymakers, there are people up there who don't understand what ecosystems are. Yeah, and I think that that is an important thing, that somewhere in the work that we do, in somewhere in the literature, we have to get it. We have to get it to people that an effort has to be made so that the layman, not only policymakers, but the layman get to understand what ecosystems are, what are the functions of ecosystems, what are the benefits that we get for it. And I think if we do that, if we start probably from the schools, to have somebody go into the schools and speak to students, you know. If you ask majority of Grenadians, for example, do you know where the air you breathe comes from? They don't, but they take it for granted. They breathe and they survive. So I think that those are some of the things that we have to consider going forward. Thank you.
I hear you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for that point of view. And no, I mean, it's not even a point of view. It's a fact of what's going on, and that there needs to be a greater level of awareness about some of the basic concepts that we're taking for granted. And thank you for pointing that out. I see Diane Roberts has a hand up.
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Budram. Morning, everybody. I joined in a bit late, so I'm not too sure if that was covered. So I just wanted to ask Dr. Daniel, just comparing the work that Baird did in the 1940s to the assessment that was done now, what, if any, was probably the most significant change observed, gathered through the ecosystem assessment, whether it's on status of a particular ecosystem or a particular species, whether from an adverse or a positive standpoint?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As I mentioned before, one big issue we've had is something as extensive as Beard. I think it's really, really, really hard to, especially when it comes to forests, really have something as thorough. We didn't come across with something as thorough as Beard. And again, the thing though that Baird was setting up forest classification. So he had a nice coverage of the region, but then he also had a nice coverage of Grenada specifically. So when he was calling out specific areas, for instance, about what the current status of the ecosystems were there, or like species compositions, we didn't do any primary data collection. So there was nothing for us to go back to see. And Baird said X area was in this status then, and then this is what it looks like now. So that's one is to be found. And when it comes to even the fauna, Groom 1970 was the most extensive source we had. But obviously for particular biota like birds, we can go to other resources for individual species. But when it comes to chronicling the status, and it's something that's super comprehensive, I would say Baird was, from what we found, we didn't find something that was specifically as comprehensive compared to Baird's work. But I saw there's a comment in that I would add a response in about one of the worries that we didn't do any primary data collection. One of the issues, I think, to really do primary data collection, to do something that would be even specifically to compare, let's say we had primary data to compare with what Baird did. I think the scope of that is a lot to be able to do such extensive forest plots or even compare them over time. I can understand why we didn't undertake work like that, because it would have been a lot. And if we tried to repeat the same for another biota, like let's say we wanted to do an extensive survey of the Grenada dove, and I know Bonnie largely uses territory mapping, which takes a while to do. If you try to do abundance counts, you need sufficient individuals to go across. So to do primary data collection in a way that we would have liked it, I think it's a separate thing altogether, but there was recent stuff you could have referred to. So like the Cooper Lab did a lot of work between 2019 and 2021 on birds in Grenada. So we had stuff you can talk about, specifics on Grenada hook-billed kites. Obviously, they're very hard to find, not low in this incidence. Broadwing hawks, which are relatively much more abundant. There was also like just general surveys done on birds, and that was Williams 2020, so his thesis is online. He had a pretty extensive survey, and I think there's another PhD student that's releasing some work as well. So even though that would not have been captured in past, at least you were able to pull that information into our chapter. Sorry for my long answer.
Okay, I need to address this actually at this point. The Grenada NEAs the Grenada NEA and the other 12 countries that are doing this process are following IPBES methodology. There's a specific methodology, which is that the assessments are supposed to be based primarily on the available literature. It actually does not allow for primary data collection. And that's something we have actually been concerned about. Having said that, though, what we are trying to do to address that is to try to capture local knowledge within the chapters as well. So for example, we just had Hayden talking about the gobies. We want to capture some of that additional information within the chapters where possible. And we've been doing things like surveys and interviews and so forth. Also to say that beyond some of the references that Jody has mentioned, we have done extensive data collection, as in terms of the literature and also records. I know we have records from the Ministry of Agriculture and so forth that we've been using. So within the parameters that we've been assigned for the Grenada NEA, we are doing the best that we can. Plus also to indicate that many of our authors are actually people who have done some of the most up-to-date research on the different topics, including Jody and her colleagues. We have, for example, Howard Nelson in chapter 6, who's doing the policy chapter, but has done a lot of work on forests and stuff as well. So the people who are doing the research are involved in this, and if they haven't, and if we've missed a particular source, please reference it and send it to us, and we can look for that as well. But unfortunately, we're not able to do field collection of data, but we are trying to capture local knowledge, records, etc., through this fora and others. So thanks for that, Diane, and thanks for pointing it out again, Joyce. Yes, we wish we could have gone out into the bush and captured information, but that's not actually part of this process. So thanks very much. I think I'm going to close off the plenary right now, and we are going to go into the breakout groups. So right now it's 11:13. We had assigned about 30 minutes. I think we're going to go for about 35 minutes in the groups. And I know we're going to go very quick and very heavy. I would urge you, we will resend the chapter summary and also the questions. So if you don't get a chance to contribute within the breakout groups, please email us. And of course, you're welcome to be an official reviewer as well. So I'm not going to share my screen. I'm just a little bit worried about the internet connection. But to explain that we are having 3 breakout sessions on chapter 2, and that each breakout session will be moderated by one of our presenters. So Jody would be heading one, Jonathan Hanna the other, and also Amy the third. Some of the Canary staff, myself, Aditi, and Sandra, who has kindly volunteered, will help moderate. But we're gonna ask you to please be concise in your statements, use the chat, and remember, if you don't get a chance to contribute within the breakout session, we do have other avenues for you as well. We have reporters assigned, rapporteurs assigned. So I think Edmund, Karim, and Jonathan Rosenberg are kindly rapporteuring, and they will report back in plenary. Just to say that each group is going through the same set of questions. So please don't feel you're missing out on one ecosystem versus another. Everybody is addressing the same material. We are going quick, hot, and heavy, but there are other avenues to contribute, and have no fear, we will be contacting you. So with that, the moderators, I think you guys will be able to share your slides, but Aaron, please go ahead and assign the breakout groups. We're going to go for 35 minutes, and then we're going to report back in plenary. Thanks. Hi guys, so thank you all very much for the rich discussions. I know we threw a lot of questions at you all. As I keep saying throughout the session, this is a teaser workshop. You know, we want more feedback as official reviewers, please. We will share the questions again, and please send us any sort of detailed emails that you all want to do. So sorry, just to clarify, there are different options, right? So please email us back with any quick feedback you all have, especially when we send out the summary documents again. And then we're also looking for people to go through the actual chapters. And if you're interested, please let us know as well through a DT. Right, so as I said, we did this very sort of quick and dirty, but it was useful, especially in our group, and I'm hoping in the others as well, because we are trying to get a sense of what people are most concerned about, what's in their minds, what we need to kind of capture in the sort of local knowledge and perspective sections of our chapters. And I'm hoping we were able to do that, even if we didn't do every single ecosystem or every single geographic area or species, but we've captured enough that we have a good flavor, and there are opportunities for further feedback. So we're going to go ahead and do the plenary reporting back. And Karim, can I put you on the spot to start with our group? And I don't know, I mean, feel free to talk, just unmute and give a flavor. Thank you. Please go ahead, Karim.
Yes, greetings to everyone. Like Natalie mentioned, the discussion begun somewhat structured, but as people, you know, giving comments, and so we kind of become very free-flowing. So I'm going to attempt to relay that information through the jottings that I took. Of course, persons who are contributing both verbally as well as in the chat. So I tried to take information from. So this is what I came up with. In terms of the threats, the first question looked at the areas around Grenada where lionfish are more prevalent. And initially, persons were even mentioning, is there any lionfish? But then you say that they're most abundant in the marine areas.
Sorry, Karan, I think we lost you for a bit, but I think the point you were trying to make is it's pretty much widespread. So much so people could even identify one particular area. And I think we were advised to maybe check with the dive shops to get some more info as to specific locales where they're really prevalent. Yeah?
Yeah, and then they're saying you could get some information probably like from histories or the nature conservation. Dive shops, they even mentioned specific names that we can look at in order to get information in terms of the lionfish population. You also mentioned that you can contact fisheries, TNC, and so in terms of getting that information. We move forward to talk about the sargassum situation in Grenada, and persons mentioned that it might see it more prevalent in places like Surtees and Grenville. You also mentioned it's moving, right? So at one point in time, it might be collected in a certain area, might be giving off a certain very bad odor. And then even to the point where people might want to move from that area, mentioned, but it moves, but it tends to gather in areas like Subies and so. They say it was also monitored over some time, and it said that it has been increasing by about 10% every year for the last 3 years or so, but it's more prevalent in the eastern areas. However, it has been identified the St. Mark's, St. John area, Victoria, between like February to August, and in the St. John, St. Mark area from like from July to like September. So it's spreading basically, and it has this negative impact on the liberty and everything of persons there. In terms of the gaps, we were looking at the titiri, talking about how prevalent it is in Grenada in terms of population and harvest. And they say that it probably still existing. As a matter of fact, it was mentioned that a contingent was observed in Annandale and stuff, which is good. I myself remember to have that very regular back in the days, even in the Victoria area and stuff like that. But it was mentioned that probably there's a lack of information transfer, so that the harvesting and stuff may have been reduced just due to persons not being having the know-how and so to get it done. But nonetheless, we say more in the eastern area, like La Poterie, Paradise, Simoon, and the Bushry and stuff like that, they might be prevalent. It was also mentioned that certain schools may have some information on it. For instance, Presentation Brothers College was mentioned as a school that should have some information kind of get some data on that. In terms of other gaps and other discussions that we have, because it came to a point where a lot of information will be thrown out. Because of course the persons involved, they're very knowledgeable, and persons who had a lot of concerns, we were trying to specify them based on the ecological area, but we kind of mixed up in terms of coastal areas, forested areas, and freshwater.
So Karan, because we did have such a free-flowing discussion, perhaps you could just throw out maybe some of what we highlighted, also in the interest of time. So don't stress yourself to do it by ecosystem. You know, maybe just say people were concerned about this area with regards to this species, regardless of the ecosystem.
No problem.
Because I know we went very free-flowing, and I apologize to you as rapporteur.
No problem. No problem. Well, what others mentioned, one of the major concerns was limited information in regards to different species and stuff that might be around. But nonetheless, we looked at persons being concerned about things like the white cedar, the high north forest of Carriacou. People mentioned iguana hunting. People talk about butterflies and dragonflies not being in abundance as one time. Also a slow return of snakes and serpents, which indicates that they have not been around for some time. So, a distinction was mentioned that we have to make sure we look at whether the species is invasive or native, and how these may impact the ecosystem. There's also mention of the invasive crops that are being brought into the country, different new species, and how that may impact everything. They also mentioned the use of agrochemicals and how that might influence the ecosystem. Spraying for mosquitoes, blight sprays, etc. Also mentioned hotel work affecting the ecology, like the Las Vegas area. There's also mention for the oyster bed mangrove system in Carriacou, Kabwe, unhealthy due to coastal erosion. Northern Carriacou mangroves vulnerable to plastic pollution. We also mentioned the wilt population also might be dwindling. We talk about the conch, we talk about different pollinators. In terms of an invasive species, we looked at one of the ones who very concerned about tilapia's invasion in the different marine systems, and so wiping out other species, especially in the Grenada area. Calvi telescope mangroves are also mentioned as getting improvement. Finally, yeah. So that's basically what.
Great. All right, thank you very, very much, Karim. Like I said, he made his job difficult, but he did a good job of capturing. And of course, we have been recording in the breakout groups, and we'll share that with the chapters towards the inclusion of this local knowledge section and where it's relevant for other pieces in terms of other data sources that people have suggested and so forth. I'm not sure who was the rapporteur for Jody's group, but grateful if you could begin. Jonathan, you rapporteur for Jody?
Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, happily. It was a very interesting discussion. We got responses based on personal observations as well as professional expertise, and everyone who responded did so, I think, with a great deal of direct personal knowledge. People, even when we didn't know the scientific or even the common names for some of the species we were talking about, everyone was very clear that they knew what they saw, what they have seen, and what they no longer see. In discussing the lionfish question, there were observations that it seemed to be prevalent in the northern part of Carriacou based on talks heard about harvesting in that area. Some of the participants had seen people actually selling it, and someone noted that it was on the calabash menu, in fact. And that is also observed on the west coast area of Grenada. For sargassum, the eastern part of Grenada, the Soubise area, Bathway, were all mentioned. For tree at the mouths of rivers, although this was admittedly not based on very recent information, and one of the participants had seen it in the St. John's area and seen it sold on Fish Friday and at roadside stands. For the discussion of ecosystem types, and I should mention that we didn't get all the way through specifically the list of questions, but comments were made that addressed all of them directly or indirectly. For specific plants and animals in threat of extinction or extirpation, the nine-banded armadillo was mentioned. A variety of municipal plants, I'm sorry, medicinal plants were discussed. There was some discussion about a plant that no one could recall the name of, but is notable for both its foul odor and its medicinal properties. And there were discussion of tree species of various kinds, including one under threat from mealybug infestation. And frogs were mentioned, including piping frogs that are under threat, iguana and manitou, both varieties of opossum. There was a discussion of notably decreasing populations associated with habitat loss and overhunting. And for amphibians and reptiles, snakes, frogs, and fish as well, there was discussion of loss associated with the use of agricultural chemicals for fertilizers and pesticides. Iguanas were singled out for discussion for threats from habitat loss and overhunting. There was some mention of the problem of lack of awareness and knowledge by local people, not knowing exactly what they were seeing, what they were harvesting, but knowing that it was of interest to them or useful to them in some ways. And so that kind of underscored some of the plenary discussions about the notion of what an ecosystem is and what the role of different species are. There's also some discussion of rising pest and infestations. And when it came to a discussion of top threats to ecosystems overall, land use, especially related to development, was singled out. Levera and the development of the golf course and tourism facilities there was talked about as a threat to the freshwater ecosystem there. And surface runoff and pollution more generally was discussed in threats to freshwater and to marine in nearshore ecosystems. And then there was a very informed and lively discussion on inappropriate on-site wastewater disposal practices, inadequate septic systems, lack of knowledge in cleaning and maintenance, the lack of due diligence on the part of those who are responsible for overseeing the management of those systems. There was a post in the chat about improper waste disposal practices by the yachting community as well. And a lot of the talk circled around these sort of the negative effects of dysfunctional or inadequate or poorly maintained septic systems for leaching into freshwater systems for eventually winding up in the sea and negatively and damaging marine ecosystems, including being associated with coral reef damage as well. And there was, I think, a very useful summative comment about all of that, that the impact is always felt at the coastal zone and the near coastal marine ecosystems because of the nature of the islands. Everything runs off eventually into the sea. So there were some very specific and useful suggestions about delineating point and non-point sources of pollution, and the contribution of a study that two of the participants were involved in that really drills down on the problems of improper on-site wastewater disposal practices that I imagine is probably going to find its way into the bibliography on chapter 2.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I noted the speed at which you did that, and it is much appreciated. Nonetheless, it was very comprehensive, and I thank you very much for your rapporteuring services.
My pleasure.
Okay, last rapporteur is Edmund, I believe.
Yes, hi. Yeah, I'm reporting for our group on what some of the issues that we discussed in our breakout group. Some of the main issues pertaining to threats of invasive species, which is the lionfish. It was a large population was given in the south of the island, and there's a high level of risk to our mangrove and the coastal areas, which would cause coastal erosions due to the negligence of the EIA, which is the environmental impact assessment. Please forgive me that the room is pretty loud, so please forgive the loudness of the
Not a problem, Edmund. Please do your best.
The impact of the sargassum seaweed, it is most impacted on the eastern side, places like Marquise, Suez, and Carriacou. They are all infected with the sargassum seaweed, which causes us to have a very pungent odor on that site. There's another very important point that was brought up, that the EIAs are not being done properly by the planning department. They are not actually implementing the EIAs, especially in areas such as the Lasages and the Livera. They are not being completed with the environment in mind. It is being completed with the developers more in to promote the development of those particular areas. When we move on to different species, there was a note that the Cuban tree frog, more information is needed on the Cuban tree frog in Grenada. They should have a little bit more of the primary data collected within the different areas. Also, there's a concern that the dry forests are being cut down to plant cane by a different company in the north of the island who's cutting down the forest to plant sugar cane. One of the recommendation is that a better monitoring system should be implemented, so that knowing the different sections of the forest that are cut down and are utilized for the different sugarcane produce. Another thing was highlighted was the education of the population, because a lot of the personnel, the people within the different areas, they definitely they don't have understanding of the different terminologies, and likewise this also causes a threat and it impacts the environment very negatively. Also, we also looked at the protection of the different areas by the Ramsar and its importance towards the preservation of those areas. It seemed that the information, the areas are not being noticed, or the persons who are protecting the areas are being ignored, that those areas ought to be protected for migratory birds so that they can have places to roost when they are in transit. There was also a mention of the cribo, which is a small water snake, which is there's more information needed if it's extinct or is it still in existence. Okay, that's some of the information that we covered in our session. Please feel free to add any additional information, so if I left out anything. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. So we are trying to close off in 3 minutes. And I can do a quick wrap up, but just if anybody has any last overarching comments that they would like to make before I just do a quick wrap up and next steps. Okay, so Aditi answered a question that Joyce posed in the chat. And I'm not seeing any hands for additional comments. Okay, so we can look to close off now, just with a huge thanks to everybody. First of all, our stakeholders who came and gave us their time to provide feedback and suggestion. Your input is very welcome. We will be collating and including this within the document. We're not sure yet, perhaps a section on local knowledge, perspectives, etc., but they will be reflected within our chapters. Thanks to our presenters and our authors. So our CLAs, Jody, Kerry, Jonathan, our LAs, Amy and Jonathan Hannah. Thanks so much for facilitating and presenting. Thank you very much. Thanks to our rapporteurs, Karim, Edmund, and Jonathan, who did double duty. Thank you. And of course, thanks to the Canary team, working very busily behind the scenes, Aditi, Anastasia, and Aaron. Okay, so with that, just to advise that we have done 2 chapters today. We're doing 2 more chapters on Tuesday. And if you can spare the time, we'll be very grateful if you guys are able to participate. And of course, we'll be sharing summaries of those as well. As I've mentioned, we're not doing any policy and scenarios chapters at this time. That will be towards the end of this year, early next year. All right, so I would encourage you guys to come in on Tuesday, and just a huge thanks to everybody. So thanks, goodbye, and I can ask the Canary team to please stay on, and we look out for emails from us in terms of getting more feedback, sending out the chapters again, looking for reviewers, etc. So thanks very much, guys. Bye.